Hello, I'm Michael Wales, a student in the School of Modern Asian Studies at Griffith University. We recorded this tutorial with mainly three aims in mind. Firstly, we thought that other students might be interested in the views presented on this particular topic by our tutorial group in 1982. Secondly, we chose this topic because of its importance to the foundation program in the School of Modern Asian Studies. And thirdly, we wanted to illustrate how to adhere to the topic of the paper and discussion, because that's where people often go wrong when they digress from the subject matter. So here is our tutorial group. The tutor is Nick Knight, the paper is presented by Jody, Michael is the respondent, and the other students in the tutorial group are Nova, Louis, Zoe, Adrian and Rhonda.
Well, I see we're all here now. I suppose we might as well get started. I see we've got a particularly interesting topic to discuss today, and the person who's going to present the paper is Jody, and then after her talk Michael is going to respond. Thanks, Jody.
Thank you. Well, the topic we're discussing today is why the Communist Party of China came to power in 1949. On the board I've written the factors which I found to be most important in the Communist Party's rise to power in 1949. And before I start, I'd like to clarify some terms I'll be using during the tutorial. You'll hear me speak of the KMT, which is the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Government of China, whose leader was Chiang Kai-shek, and the CCP refers to the Chinese Communist Party, who is led by Mao Zedong. The process by which the Communist Party of China came to power in 1949 is seen by some analysts to be the greatest of all China's revolutions. The year 1949 marked an important watershed in the historical development of contemporary China. Indeed, since 1949, a new approach has been taken to development in China. When the Communists came to power in 1949, they gained control over all of China with the exception of Taiwan, which housed the exiled nationalist government. In the years preceding 1949, China had been through 22 years of revolutionary experience. This experience saw the political balance gradually tip from the nationalists into the favour of the communists. When Mao Zedong assumed power in 1949, he said before a crowd of millions in Tiananmen Square, "The Chinese people will never again be enslaved. China has stood on its feet." Seen in retrospect, it seems quite paradoxical that the united front in which the nationalist government and the Communist Party joined to fight the Japanese aggressors was to be the point of fracture only a few short years later. I have on the board the factors which I'm now going to explain, which I find to be the most important, or the key factors in describing why the Communist Party came to power. Firstly, psychological factors. Secondly, military and strategic weaknesses and mistakes by the nationalist government. Thirdly, the appeal of nationalism. Fourthly, the appeal of ideology. And lastly, the appeal of leadership. To start with the psychological factors which engendered the rise of the Communist Party. Many analysts see that World War II and the war with the Japanese spelt ruin for the nationalist government. Indeed, after the war with the Japanese, the nationalist government was military, financially and politically exhausted. It also had showed the inadequacy of its leadership. In 1946, nationalist and communist rivalries seemed, the only possible solution to nationalist and communist rivalries seemed to be through all-out civil war. In the early stages of the civil war which ensued, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek primarily aimed at establishing communicative links between the Yangtze River and nationalist garrisons in northern China and Manchuria. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, was determined to prevent this from happening, and it was to this end that he worked. In the early years of the Civil War, the KMT held the military advantage. Their troops numbered over 3 million, many of which were trained by the Americans and also equipped with American weaponry. The Communist Party, on the other hand, was lacking greatly in manpower and military training. However, what the Communist Party lacked in manpower, it made up for with a high morale, efficient means of propaganda, and most importantly of all, the support of the population. After the war with the Japanese, China's economic situation was quite worrying indeed. Inflation was at staggering levels. There were drastic food shortages. These two factors together had the effect of increasing corruption amongst the nationalist officials, particularly in the treaty port areas, and also of decreasing their morale. As the tide of war turned against the nationalists, these factors also worked against the nationalists, accelerating an already disintegrating situation. So in summary, the psychological factors which engendered the rise of the communist power were the inflation and severe financial mismanagement which destroyed the livelihood of thousands of Chinese people, discredited the nationalist government greatly. It was in this psychological environment that the Communist Party of China was seen to be the only viable solution for China's future. To move on to the second main area, the military and strategic weaknesses and mistakes by the nationalist government. Perhaps Chiang Kai-shek's greatest military mistake was to act against United States advice. In doing so, Chiang Kai-shek decided to take control of Manchuria instead of defending the southern wall, the southern sector of the Great Wall. This action effectively spelt disaster for the nationalist government. Some analysts see that the nationalist government's division of forces between Manchuria and Shantung led to their failure in both quests. Through spreading themselves too thinly, they had no coherent, unified defence network. The second important factor, strategic weakness, which I see led to the rise of the CCP, was the nationalists' adherence to a conventional type of warfare. The communists, in contrast, pursued a guerrilla warfare ethic. And through pursuing this ethic of guerrilla warfare, Mao Zedong and his Communist Party were able to consolidate their power in the rural areas. And in doing so, they built up a base of mass support amongst the peasants and fused peasant warfare with guerrilla warfare. And the end result of this was to increase communist prestige of the Communist Party. So far I've only spoken of two factors, military mistakes and the psychological factors. To my mind, these are perhaps secondary factors as to why the Communist Party came to power. And I'd like to move on now to the three last factors I have listed, which I think are the primary factors in why the Communist Party and Mao Zedong came to power in 1949. First of all, the appeal of nationalism, ideology and leadership. For any government in China to win the support, they must first of all win support of both the peasants and the intellectuals, and it was in this area that the nationalist government crucially failed. Chiang Kai-shek was closely allied with the landlords and was largely dependent on them for his financial support. Because of this connection with the landlords, the nationalist government was unable to pursue land reforms which had been promised earlier in the Republican period by Sun Yat-sen. This acted to stimulate and intensify peasant unrest. The alienation which the peasants felt between themselves and the nationalist officials led them to believe that the nationalist government was not capable. Mao Zedong, however, stepped in and played on this discontent. His strategy of a people's war won immense support for his party, and his promise of land reforms and social change in the future also increased his support. To turn to the intellectuals felt that the nationalist government's view of the future of China were far too narrow and puritanic. The nationalist government advocated a resurrection of Confucianism, which was in stark contrast to the forward-looking policies of the Communist Party. And moreover, the nationalist government's secret police were particularly active in schools and universities, and they were the engineers of several assassinations of nationalist academics for the mere reason that they supported a rival party, the Democratic League. And while this secret police was going on, Mao Zedong was active in producing two pamphlets in which he expressed his policies and ideas for the future. These pamphlets were aimed at and succeeded in winning intellectual support. And the third factor, leadership qualities, I think this is the factor that perhaps was singularly most important in the Communist Party's rise to power. I feel that without the leadership and charisma of Mao Zedong, then perhaps the Communist Party would not have risen to power in 1949. Mao Zedong possessed one valuable asset, and that was he had a unique bond of identification with the peasants. He understood the peasants, and he was prepared to base the future of China, to make future China a China which would be suited to both the peasants and the intellectuals. So in doing so, the peasants and intellectuals in China at that time constituted more than 80% of the population. Mao Zedong, over and above the nationalist government, introduced a nationalism. It was a nationalism with a forward, coherent-looking ideology, which was perhaps the major reason behind the success of the CCP. So to conclude, the reasons which I've outlined as to why the Communist Party came to power. The nationalist government in 1949 overlooked one vital factor. For a new dynasty to establish influence in China, it has been traditionally necessary to gain the support of peasants and intellectuals. The nationalists continued to live under the shadow of the Confucian distinction between the rulers and the ruled. Because of this, they saw no urgency in solving the problems of the peasants and the intellectuals, and because of this, they couldn't see the revolutionary potential in these two groups in society. And it was in this area that Mao's philosophies found their most successful expression. And I'd like to finish with a quote from one noted historian. He says, "The stone which one builder rejects becomes the cornerstone of another's building."
Okay, thanks, Jody. That was a very interesting paper. Now you're going to respond, aren't you, Michael? Do you need a few seconds to collect your thoughts?
Just a few, thank you. Okay, Jody presented a very good paper, and I agree with her on most of her points, and I'd like to reiterate and summarise some of these, hoping to be able to generate even more discussion at the end of the tute. The topic, as we know, is why did the Communist Party come to power in 1949 over the KMT? And Jody has outlined several points for her reasons for why she believes this happened. And she is, if I can reiterate these are the psychological factors, military and strategic mistakes, the appeal of nationalism, the appeal of ideology, and leadership qualities. And as well, Jody commented that the communist revolution in China has been said to be the greatest of China's long history. I think I have to agree with her definitely on this. The prelude to the 1949 revolution, as Jody said, was a very interesting one and a very trying time for the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. The revolutionary experience was highlighted as well and exaggerated by the war against the Japanese, in which briefly the communists and the nationalists were linked, but only to have this relationship strained as soon as the war was over. It was obvious then that civil war would result. In the early years of the Civil War, the KMT did have an advantage of their training and military aid from the United States. But despite this, Jody has highlighted the many aggravations which worked against the KMT. If I could list these again, they were the high rate of inflation, the poverty of the masses of the people, the rejection of US military advice, and their maintaining of Confucian ideals. However, the communists had many factors working in their favour, and as Jody said, these were the appeal to nationalism, the appeal to ideology, and leadership. The promise of land reforms was, I think, a pivotal case in this revolution, in which the land reforms were promised to the peasants by the communists. This just couldn't, happen in the case of the nationalists, because many of the supporters of the Nationalist Party were in fact landholders themselves, so therefore they would not support a party which would appear to strip them of their power and their wealth. Mao's charismatic leadership qualities appealed not only to the peasant classes, but also to the intellectuals. His background was, I believe, he worked as a librarian, but from a peasant background. And his philosophies, stemming from originally Marxism and Leninism, appealed to the intellectual class because of their rejection of the Confucian ways. It has been said that the mantle of nationalism fell on the Communist Party's shoulders rather than the KMT, and I think it was because of these combined factors, definitely, that the Chinese Communist Party was able to overcome the superior military strength, yet not the superior, yet the inferior, I think would be the better word, the inferior social ramifications which were carried by the National Party.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Anyone got any questions or criticisms they'd like to raise the two papers at all?
Just going back to one point Michael made, did the intellectual support Mao and the Communist Party because of the Marxism and Leninism philosophies rather than non-Confucianism?
Well, it's hard to say. It's a sort of a chicken and egg argument. Did they support Mao because he had Marxist philosophies or because he had anti-Confucianist philosophies? What would you comment to that, Jodie?
I would tend to say that both those factors were important, but also a factor which I find important is that the population was very disillusioned with the nationalist government, and I sometimes wonder if in such a time of adversity they were driven to the Communist Party because it was the only other alternative. But I do think that the nationalists' emphasis on Confucianism was a very important factor because that wasn't what the population wanted for a future China. They'd had too long with Confucianism. It had been the cause of too many of China's ills in the past.
Perhaps Confucianism also can be seen as one of the factors which prevented the Kuomintang from actually implementing these reforms that you said needed to be undertaken.
Yes. Yes.
Can I just ask, everyone was talking about the ideological appeal, can I ask who the ideology appealed to really?
To the peasants and to the intellectuals.
Do you think it would have appealed to a sort of an elderly peasant man who's been brought up with tradition and to get all these anti-Confucian ideas?
I think perhaps he would have been overcome by the promise of more land and a brighter future to worry about what he's lived his life by so far. After the war, the countryside was particularly ravished, and I think perhaps that he forgot, or he didn't forget, but he thought that the promise of more land in the future was at that time more important than the ideals of Confucianism to which he's adhered all of his life.
But Confucianism was something like a family order, really, and was it something of a challenge to all that?
So you're saying that Confucianism was not just an ideology as such, it was a social structure as well?
A social structure, it's not just a political platform.
But it was a social structure which had been crumbling since perhaps the May 4th movement and even before. So considering that it had been crumbling since the early 20th century, perhaps 20 odd years before this revolution or civil war took place, I think that's quite a long time for it to start to decay. So perhaps it wasn't as strong as perhaps it was earlier.
And it was a philosophy and ideology which did favour the landholding classes and the bureaucratic class. So it wouldn't have held very much appeal to the peasant classes.
I wonder if one doesn't have to stress more highly the prominence of nationalism in this transfer of allegiance from one sort of ideology to another. The fact that the invasion of the Japanese army showed quite clearly the incompetence of those forces which were actually supporting Confucianism or the restoration of Confucianism. Do you think that one can sort of juxtapose these two different causal factors? Was it nationalism, which was the main cause of the communist success, or was it the revolutionary impetus which was underway within the Chinese villages themselves? Can you see these as two separate things, or did they somehow merge, do you think?
Well, I don't know about Michael, but I tend to think that perhaps no one factor is dominant, but they all merge together.
A combination of events and factors.
Yes.
Plus Mao being there at the right time.
Yes,
Yes,
leadership was a very necessary thing, and often throughout history we see leaders emerge from situations like this, and Mao is a good example of a charismatic leader in this sense.
I was, perhaps if I could bring up, direct a question to the group, which is one I find particularly interesting, and that is, do you think the communists would have gained power in 1949 if Mao Zedong hadn't been the leader? What does the group think? It's one of the have-beens of history, or the ifs of history.
I don't see how Mao's leadership could have been so very much effective as opposed to someone else being the leader, because China's such a big country and so many millions of people. There'd be all those people that never saw him or ever heard him speak. So I feel some other people could have filled his role, and maybe the Communist Party would have come to power anyway.
Well, Chiang Kai-shek was another leader, but he wasn't able to do the same. He didn't have the same qualities of leadership as Mao. I think it.
Had
Nobody.
the same party behind it.
But is the man the party, or is the party the man?
It raises really difficult theoretical problems, that sort of question, because you're saying, well, you know, what emphasis do you put on just leadership itself, you know, on the charismatic historical figure, as opposed to these massive social forces like nationalism, revolutionary factors within the Chinese villages, which may have created the situation in which a leader like Mao could have had the impact that he did.
Probably somebody else could have done it, but it may have taken longer because of Mao's...
I tend to think that nobody else could have done it as well as Mao did, because he was a peasant by birth, and he was one of the people. And if you look back at Chinese history, disregarding the dynasties from 1840 through until 1949, China had no coherent political ideology, it had no coherent leadership. And I think that Mao Zedong performed a tremendous feat in bringing China back. Perhaps some people would agree that he made a bigger mess of it than it's ever been a mess before. But I think I tend to feel that without Mao Zedong, China wouldn't be China as we know it today, and the revolution in 1949 may have had a different outcome.
Well, I have to disagree with you. I think the whole thing, all your presentations have been talking about how the Communist Party was appealing to the people and to the masses, and you can see all that behind the scenes work that they had their cadres in the villages, talking to the villagers and winning them over, winning the peasants over. And such a vast majority of the Chinese people would never have even seen Mao Zedong. And so I think it was inevitable that the Communist Party was going to win, and Mao Zedong was just the leader. And a good leader. I think he's a good political leader. He could lead a political party.
But he led the Long March across half of China.
Well, that's where he gained his leadership, during the Long March.
But if the people hadn't been ready, it wouldn't have mattered how much they talked to them in the villages if they weren't ready for a change.
That's
But I think you're agreeing with Adrian in a sense, yes.
That's what I'm trying to say. It could have been Mao
conditions.
Zedong, or it could have been another person who was high up in leadership in that place, I feel, and the CCP would have won anyway, because the leadership wasn't, the man on top wasn't the matter that really counted there.
Well, I agree with Adrian in some points. I think the question is there that was it Mao or could someone else have done it? Well, I think somebody else could have done it, but they would have had to have a similar background and similar appeal and similar personality. And your point about the party cadres in the villages, a word of this new leader, this new man who actually walked with his fellow peasants, would have had quite an effect, considering they were used to having a definite and often physical stratification between leaders and the peasant classes. So that hearing of this man who actually walked side by side and led physically these people would have had, I think, a very deep, very emotive effect on these people. If
I could possibly change the tilt of the discussion, I think we've worn out the qualities of Mao Zedong. For the moment, anyway. I'd like to ask the group what they think of why were the nationalists and not the communists exhausted by World War II and the war with the Japanese? Why were the communists so exhausted and not the nationalists?
Well, the communists.
Why were the nationalists
all the way
not
around.
the communists?
I think it was communists were living off the land more or less. They started off.
Is it perhaps something to do with the strategy? Chiang Kai-shek's strategy was fight the disease of the blood first, I think, or wasn't it? Whereas, was it perhaps something to do with strategy and the way they went about fighting the war?
Could it have been too that the nationalists were the, in a poor choice of words, the official army of China, and therefore they had the major responsibilities to uphold things like the Geneva Convention and international law, whereas the communists, they could fight with their guerrilla tactics, and what they used, I suppose, they tried to produce mostly themselves, living off the land, as, did you say that, Adrian? As Adrian said, that sort of effect.
It's quite a difficult question, but I've got a feeling that the fact that the Chiang Kai-shek and nationalists chose not to take a very prominent role in terms of offensive warfare against the Japanese may have, in the long term, have had a debilitating effect on the military structure and efficiency of the nationalist forces. Because right through the war, Chiang Kai-shek's tactic was to play this waiting game.
That's right, wait until they're attacked.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's also the fact that the KMT had the job of being the Chinese government at that stage and had to administrate to a certain extent as well as fight the Japanese, the communists, and try and get them. And the communists at that time were only concerned with gaining power, and they didn't really have to worry themselves about other things.
There was one thing that interested me in your papers. Neither of you mentioned the factor of overpopulation as a causal factor in the rise of the communists. Do you both dismiss this as an argument or a factor in this, the rise of the communists, or do you think it's something that has to be looked at through other factors like psychological factors or inflation? Or
I think we mentioned it indirectly in mentioning the inflation and the poverty. We should have perhaps pointed it out more directly, but we couldn't deny it being a factor, I don't think.
No.
It's interesting because Mao himself denied that it was a factor in the Chinese Revolution, because the American State Department came out in 1949 with this big paper about why the communists had won, and they isolated overpopulation as one of the major factors why the communists had won. And Mao nearly hit the roof when he read this, and he said it was absolute nonsense, that China had too many people. And that's when he came out with his famous statement that of all the things in the world that are most precious, people are the most precious.
Yes, I was just going to comment on that paradox of him denying the statement, yet the basis of Mao's philosophy right up until 1976 was more people, more power, populate China, the power of the human mind and soul.
Well, I think he started to have second thoughts towards the end, but too many Chinese.
Could I just ask if Mao Zedong was the only person who ever promised land reform?
No, Sun Yat-sen in the Republican period, and his three principles of the Tung Men Hui, something like that, had promised things like people's democracy and land reform. So Mao Zedong wasn't the first to promise them, but he was the first to act on the promises. He was the first to do something concrete about it.
It must be stressed that the Kuomintang actually did have a land reform program, but it was remained on paper by and large, and it was a bureaucratic exercise which never really affected the lives of the mass of the Chinese peasantry. I think the difference with the communists was with the cadres, as you say. The communist members used to go into the villages and try to organise the Chinese peasantry to take action for themselves.
I'm sure you don't agree with everything we've said, but we hope that you've been stimulated to form your own views on this topic, which you might use in a tutorial presentation or essay or in a group discussion.